Welcome to Train Freediving. In this video, I'm going to tell you about an easier and more effective way to do your training with what I call reverse apnea tables. I believe that one of my jobs, both as a coach and as an athlete, is to try and make mine and your training as easy and effective as possible. The easier it feels, the more likely you are to do it, and the more effective it is, the more results you're going to get from your training. Now, I believe that reverse apnea tables is one of those things. It's going to be easier and more effective. So a combination of the both, giving you the best results and the best quality training possible. On a side note, I don't want to take 100% credit for this concept of using reverse apnea tables. There may be divers out there who are already doing what I'm going to explain, and I'm not saying I'm the first person to think about this. However, I haven't seen it myself. I don't really know anyone who's talking about it. So if you are doing this already, let me know what you call it, and let me know why you chose to do it. But if not, I hope that what I'm going to share with you today can help you have better quality training and maybe an easier and more enjoyable time training as well. Now I'm going to compare traditional dynamic apnea tables with reverse dynamic apnea tables, tell you guys a little bit what the difference is, show you with some help of some graphs physiologically what the two differences are, what's happening with classic tables and what is happening differently with reverse tables, and why I think reverse tables are a little bit more effective for your dynamic apnea training versus using something like a traditional or classic format for a table. Traditionally, the way that we're generally taught to approach training tables in the pool, and for argument's sake, even in static, is to set them up in one of two ways. So we'll have a series of short distances, and then between each distance, we're going to have short recoveries. And normally, these short recoveries either descend, so they get shorter and shorter as the table progresses, or they're going to stay the same for the duration of the entire table. In my opinion, this approach of having descending recovery or recovery which stays the same is a flawed approach. There are a lot of problems with doing it this way that make your tables less effective than they could be. Normally what's going to happen using a traditional table is that at the beginning of the table, your training isn't going to be very effective. You're kind of wasting your time building up to the end of the table. And then the very end of the table, maybe the last 1 to 2 or even 3 laps, depending on how aggressively you start, are going to actually be too hard. And again, training too hard is just as ineffective as not training hard enough. So the beginning and end of your table is ineffective, and only the middle is going to be effective. And I'm going to show you how that happens with the help of the table. So normally speaking, when you're doing your table, we're going to increase CO2, have a long recovery, increase CO2 again, and then as the recoveries get shorter and shorter, the CO2 is going to rise. Now, it's also important to note, as the peripheral parts of our body fill up with CO2, they become saturated because of the efforts that we're doing. The CO2 in our core, so the CO2 that actually matters, is going to rise faster and faster. So the angle of these lines is actually going to get steeper and steeper, and we're going to accumulate more CO2 per breath hold, even though the laps are the same distance. And this is where problems are going to start to happen. So as the recovery gets shorter and the CO2 curve starts to steepen up, we start to build more and more CO2 per breath hold, and the actual rate of increase is going to get faster and faster through the breath hold. So if we were to draw a line through all the breath holds like this, you'll see that the average CO2 through the entire table is going up faster and faster. Now, if we were to imagine that these two red dotted lines represent the ideal amount of CO2 that you should be having to train with, this shows that all of this bit of the table and then all of this bit of the table is ineffective. Only in the middle are we doing good quality training. We're actually getting the results and the stimulus that we need, and the rest of it was kind of wasted. Now, the exercise example that goes with the classic method that I was showing you would be something like 8 times 25 meter laps with recovery counted in number of breaths, starting at 7 breaths recovery and then descending by 1 breath all the way down to 1. Reverse training tables solve these problems. And what I mean by reverse is that instead of having a recovery strategy which gets shorter and shorter as the table progresses, we're actually going to set up our table in a way where the recovery is going to get longer and longer. Now what this means is that by starting with aggressive recoveries, a very short few recoveries at the beginning, we can quickly spike our CO2 up into the zone that's actually going to be effective. As the recovery gets longer and longer, we're going to take advantage of the fact that the rate of CO2 increase is speeding up, but by making our recovery longer, we're going to be able to stay for longer within the effective amount of CO2 that we need for the training. So a reverse table would look something like this. The first few breath holds will have normal CO2 increase, short recovery, normal CO2 increase, a little bit longer recovery, and then as the recoveries get longer, the CO2 kind of balances out and it stays right within the range that we're trying to expect. If I was to draw a curve through all the breath holds on the graph, the average CO2 is going to look something like this. So we spend more time with the correct amount of CO2 within the effective training range. And what that's going to mean is that we're only really wasting the first 2 breath holds. The first 2 or maybe even 3 breath holds are there just to set us up, and then as the recovery gets longer, we're able to drop our average CO2. We're able to stop the increase of average CO2 and actually stay within what we should expect as an effective training. To share with you the exercise that would work with the reverse table is going to be the complete opposite of what we did with the classic table. Again, we're going to do 8 times 25 meters, but on this time the recovery strategy is going to be 1 breath, then 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and so on breaths until we finish the 8 laps. Should all divers be starting at 1 breath up to 7? Or should you consider maybe starting at 3, 4, or even 5 breaths? And for me, there's a very simple way to figure this out. If you can do 50 meters without having any contractions or strong urge to breathe, then you can probably start your table at 2 breaths for the first time, and then after that you can adjust if you have to adjust it up to 3 or down to 1 to have a perfect balance of aggressive at the beginning and just enough recovery at the end, then you can do that. Now, if you're a diver who cannot do 50 meters without contractions yet, you still need to train your CO2 tolerance, then perhaps starting at 4 breaths recovery on the first lap and then adding 1 breath per lap. This means that you'll end at 10 breaths on the last lap, might be something better for you. And then again, if you need to adjust it up to 5 or 6, or maybe even down to 3 or 2, depending on how you're feeling, you can go from there. So just to recap the adjustments, if you're able to do 50 meters with no contractions, I would suggest starting at 2 recovery breaths and then adjusting up and down from there. And if you can't do 50 without contractions yet, I would suggest starting at 4 breaths and then adjusting up or down from there. Good training is all about finding the path of least resistance. You want to do things in the most effective and efficient way possible, and normally, if you can do this, the exercise is going to produce the same or even better results than another exercise, and it's going to feel easier. This table, or this style of table, really does that. It gives us more time during the table with the appropriate amount of CO2 that we want, and it's a little bit easier than doing a normal traditional CO2 table. So that being said, you're able to do more repetitions of the table in a session. So in my case, if I did a classic CO2 table, if I kind of push myself a little bit, I can force myself to do 2 repetitions of a classic table, and then at the end I'm tired of doing it and I don't want to do any more. But with a reverse table, doing 3 repetitions of a table is actually really easy psychologically, and I could probably even do 4 or 5 if I chose to. So there you have it. That's my logic and reasoning as to why doing a reverse apnea table, a table that's designed with a recovery that gets actually progressively longer as the table goes on, is going to be more effective. I suggest that you give it a try. Experiment with starting at 2, 3, 4, 5, maybe even 1 recovery breaths. Play around with it. Try to find the ideal starting point to finish the entire table without having any contractions. But for the majority of the table, you should be finishing your laps right at the edge of having your first contraction. So that's the perfect adjustment. Train it for a bit, and then you can remove recovery breaths as you get better and better. Give it a try. Let me know how it goes. I can almost guarantee that you're going to feel the table working right away. You'll feel that CO2 increase. You'll feel like you're doing some work, but it's not going to get so hard that you're not able to finish it. It's not going to get so hard that it's mentally draining, and you're going to be able to do this over and over again in a relatively comfortable way. Make your lives easy and let your training do its job without having to try and kill yourself, pushing yourself right to the limit, suffering through hard training tables when you can do something like this and actually let your training be enjoyable, easy, and fun to do.